everyone. I think we are officially live. So, today we're gonna have a discussion about the controller again. Because the controller has been really available to my conscious awareness as of late. Probably because they're freaking out a little bit, which is usually when we have a tendency to see more of the controller. We see the controller when the controller is not happy. When everything is exactly as the controller wants it to be, they're a lot harder to spot. But if everything's the way the controller wants it to be, that usually means that we're living a pretty status quo, risk-free life. Which I know that may sound really good to you on the surface because the controller likes that, but in fact it is really very stagnant, and it isn't how humans are supposed to be. That's why I want to talk to you today about this idea of how our controllers will battle against change. And I'll be honest, this battle is probably one of the biggest sources in our lives of angst, so to speak, like of anxiety, of not being able to be present and calm or peaceful or happy or anything, is because we tend to have this inner part, and it's a biggie, right? This is a hugely influential inner part in our system that cannot handle change and generally is always fearing it, even when things aren't changing very much. So this part keeps us out of the present moment and always in a bit of a fight. Because the truth is, this world is meant to be pretty temporary most of the time. And no, I don't mean the entire world, although, I mean, relatively, I guess it's also temporary. But the things that are happening in this world are generally here for a little while, and then they're gone. Right? Now, obviously, that can be relative. Some things are here for a very short time, and some things are here for a little while longer. But in the scheme of things, it's still pretty temporary. So, I want to talk today about how we battle the temporary nature of the world around us and how that is incredibly unhelpful for us, and kind of getting an idea of what we can do about it. This is not an overnight change, but you probably already gathered that. So we will talk a little bit about how we can go about building awareness of that, understanding where it's coming from, and being able to start shifting a little bit out of that pattern. So I want to say hi to Carol. Thank you for being here. So let's talk a little bit about how our controllers battle change. And we'll start by talking about why the controller feels the need to do that in the first place. Because if we don't understand the why, it becomes difficult to understand much else, really. So we're going to start there. And remember, the controller, no matter how much they pretend to be an adult in your life, they generally are a very scared teenager. They are generally not coming at life from an adult perspective. That is the aspect of self I call the grounded adult self. And I'll be honest, for most of us with complex trauma, we don't spend a ton of time connected to the grounded adult self. We are generally operating from the controller or from another part, and that means there's a lot of fear playing out in our decisions. And that's what we want to start to change. But in order to change that, we have to see how the parts are running our lives so that we can then see how we can interject into some of those decisions before they get made, or even after they get made, depending on the decision. So let's talk first about why the controller is so terrified of change. And I have three. I love the number 3. I will use 4. I will use 5. I'll use whatever I have, but I just love sharing 3 reasons with you. Maybe society has taught me that idea. But the controller is terrified of change, and I'm going to talk about 3 reasons. And you can bet that all 3 of these reasons have a tremendous amount of fear behind them. You can also bet that that fear started in our childhoods when we were trying to cope with our environment and didn't have any control at all over that environment. Okay. Now, feel free to add your own perspectives around how your controllers may be afraid of change and what that looks like for you. I would love to hear about that. So let's talk about 3 ways here that I've written down. The first one is that the change to the controller means that there is unknown ahead. Okay. To a controller, the unknown is always bad. One of the ways I tend to describe the controller, sometimes I come up with these mantras that are specific to particular parts. And for the controller, one of the big ones is the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. So that is one that I say a lot. A lot of the things the controller says do come from that particular mindset. Now, they might not use that exact phrase, right? But they will use things that are close to it. Isn't it better to just do what you know? Isn't it better to just be associated with things that you're familiar with? Life isn't so bad. Why can't you just be grateful for what you have? Why do you need to have more? Sometimes the word selfish will get thrown out here. Like, you're selfish for wanting something different. You're selfish for wanting something more. And I'll be honest, a lot of times it's the opposite of selfishness, because in order to grow and change and make more risky decisions, we do have to let things go, which is the number one nemesis of the controller. They do not want to let things go. And we're going to talk more about that. So the second one I have here, as for the why, is that change might mean the controller will lose control over something. And you've probably already gathered from the name of the controller that control is extremely important to them. So what will often happen when they lose this control, they'll lose control, let's say, over a part, right? Or they'll lose control over some kind of external situation that they've been trying to control. Or they'll lose control over an emotion. Now, most of these moments where control is lost are caused by unforeseen triggers. The controller gets very, very good at avoiding triggers in our lives. They will create a schedule. They will literally build a life around avoiding triggers. If there's a lot of change, the controller can't avoid triggers in the same way. Sometimes we can see this in smaller ways, like if we go on vacation or we go to a new place or we're doing something we haven't done before. That alone can bring up triggers. Even if we're talking about something that's temporary or pretty small in the scheme of things, triggers will often show up when things change. So the controller thinks that one of the best ways to make life work for them is to schedule a life around trigger avoidance. So when we start making changes, triggers show up. And that's something the controller desperately wants to avoid. And I'll also say that sometimes when we're making changes, we're gonna butt up against our trauma and our contracts that we may have with abusers. Sometimes breaking some of those contracts, which is definitely a huge trigger, and it will potentially trigger the karma kid, who is the one that usually holds contracts, leaving the controller with a bit of an emotional mess that they don't want to deal with. So again, they would rather stick to the schedule that avoids the triggers altogether. It doesn't push on any of those contracts or triggers from childhood if they can avoid it. So that's a huge one for them. It's important to note. Let's see. I want to say hi to Bernadette and Jan and Trish. Bernadette is saying the last few months in constant flight is that controller can't connect. Yeah, it depends on exactly what the flight looks like. Sometimes flight can be freedom fighters, I'll be honest, but not always. Flight can be a controller's attempt to avoid triggers, right? So sort of what we're talking about. Controller can run from triggers. And one of the ways they do that is by avoiding change, right? But I will also say that flight is a big one for freedom fighters as well. They are runners. They're the runners of the system. They do not have any problem with change. They will constantly change up your life to get away from control. Generally speaking, that's what they're trying to do. And they also do a lot of fighting with the controller because of that. They're not only fighting control externally, but they are fighting control internally as well. So flight is a big one for the freedom fighters too. So I'm not sure which part it is that's putting you into flight mode, but anything you can do to ground and connect with the message behind the flight is going to help you. Because if we don't understand the why, like we're talking about right now, it can be very hard to do much else with it. We need to get an understanding of what is behind the desired actions that are showing up for us, right? So the last of the three reasons the controller's terrified of change is that generally change means a very exhausting fight to get ourselves back into status quo, back into some kind of comfort level for the controller. The controller uses up a tremendous amount of our energy trying to avoid our triggers of trauma, trying to suppress our emotions and the other parts in the system. This is a full-time job. And the reason we are often completely exhausted, right, is because we are doing all of this behind the scenes. It's not even that much about what we're doing externally. So much of our energy is being used internally on this battle, which then makes it very difficult for us to have the energy to do a whole lot externally, right? So this is a big, big battle for us. So when we make changes, the controller has to go through an entire process of moving us back into some level of comfort and status quo. And so that takes a ton of energy. And I'll be honest, the older we get, the less of that energy is available and the less power the controller has over a system. It's why for most of us, we start this journey when we're a bit older, whatever that looks like for you. That is the way that it works. Because when we're young, like when we're in our 20s, the controllers are on fire. We have all this energy. We can suppress and still like live a pretty active life, although it's going to be a life that's full of a lot of potential re-traumatization, but the controller is just very happy to be in charge, right? But then as we get older, that starts to fall away. The controller weakens. In general, our energy is getting a little more depleted. So the more the controller weakens, the less a fan they're going to be of change, because they're not sure if they're going to be able to pull us back into the status quo at the end of that change. Now, it doesn't mean we should be going back into that status quo again. This is what the controller wants, to avoid the triggers and avoid their fears. But that isn't necessarily what's best for us as a whole, right? So the next thing I'm going to talk about is how this shows up in our daily lives. So we're talking about the why, and then I want to talk about what it looks like potentially on a daily basis. There's this movie out there with Nicolas Cage where he's a con artist, and I totally can't remember the name of it, but it might be something as simple as like Con Man. I can't remember. But the way he lives his life at the beginning of the movie is the epitome of the way the controller wants to live. If you haven't seen just the opening part, I highly recommend it if you're trying to figure out what does a controller look like when they are completely in charge. This guy really nails it at the beginning of that movie. The rest of the movie, not so much. It's an example of what happens to a controller when they're thrown into complete and utter chaos and change. So let's talk about how this shows up in our life. So the first one is a deep commitment to the status quo. Deep, deep commitment. Like working so incredibly hard in a rigid fashion to maintain status quo, to make all the days look somewhat like each other, and to have significant anxiety when something about the day is not like the normal day. Right? Even having so much anxiety about that you can't wait for something to be over, even if it's something fun, even if it's something you've been looking forward to even for months or years. Knowing that it's going to come in and be a part of that day and it's going to throw off the normal schedule and make everything look different will bring up anxiety, even if it is truly a very pleasant experience. So this deep, deep commitment to status quo is a huge part of a controller life. The next one is that the controller will hold on to things which have been trying to release, and they'll do it in even some really unusual and sometimes even quite creative ways. I like to think of the controller. I don't know if you guys have seen the memes out there where it's like the hand and the hand is holding the rope, but the hand is like practically bleeding from holding the rope. That's the controller. That's a really good explanation of how they are. I remember when I first started this journey, I was joining some groups like self-development, self-help groups for a while, and we would pull these cards right out of these decks, and I kept pulling the same card every single time. It was like the universe was like, we're going to get through to you. And that card was about surrender, right? It was about letting go. So very clearly, the message to my controller, loud and clear, was stop holding on to everything that makes you feel safe and comfortable and okay. Now, my controller did not like pulling this card over and over again. You might imagine they were pitching a little bit of a fit on the inside, but I didn't show that on the outside. But it was a pretty strong message that I needed to let go of something, because we do. When we're in that strong controller, we hold on. Whatever it might be, it could be holding on to things. There could be things that give you comfort that feel like you just have to have them. And even when those things start to break down, even when those things start to just really not be a good idea for us to have anymore, we will still be holding on. This can, of course, also be people. So we can hold on to people who are very bad for us, sometimes even people who are abusive to us. We are holding on for dear life, right? We're making excuses for them. We're saying, oh, it's okay. It's still a good relationship for me. But in the end, it actually really isn't. And it can also mean holding on to like a living situation. Maybe there's a better place you need to live. Maybe there's a better place you need to move. Maybe there's something that's sort of calling to you. But your controller is there going, nope, 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 no, 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 we're not going in that direction. And I find that sometimes when that's going on, my current environment starts to show me that it doesn't want me there anymore. I know that sounds a little odd to say it that way, but sometimes the current environment is very clearly saying, you're done with us now. Like, it's time for something new. And the controller's like, no, I'm gonna make it fit, right? Like, I'm gonna put that square into that circle, in that hole, and I'm gonna cram it in there, I'm gonna make it fit, I'm gonna do it, no matter what. Stubborn, 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 stubborn. Stubborn as can be, right? That's the controller holding on for dear life, when things are often literally telling us that they are not for us anymore. Or people. They may not say it, but they're saying it, right? So this is a big one for the controller. And then the last one I have under this section is years can be spent trying to maintain a life that doesn't work for us. The problem with this is for every year we spend on something that doesn't work for us, our grief builds. Because one of the things we have to grieve is time. Okay. And the more time we hold on to something that doesn't work for us, the more time we need to grieve to let it go, which you might imagine then makes it harder to let it go. And I see this all the time, people going, I will not budge from the way I have lived this life and done things. I will not budge from that, because if I do, it means that all the time that I spent doing that was invalid, or was a waste of time, or was not a great contributor to the life I wanted to lead. And this can be This can make it very, very difficult. The longer we do that, the harder it is to stop doing that. And this is a very important lesson for us. It's a tough one. It's a tough lesson. And I've had to learn it a few times in a really, really hard way. But it is something, like, no matter how long you've been holding on to something that may not be working for you, it is never too late to let it go, despite the fact that the controller is likely telling you that it is. And they will, believe me, they will tell you that it's too late. So Jan is saying surrender to allowing. Yes, I think surrender and allowing are very similar in concept, right? When we surrender, we are allowing something new to come in and help us in our lives to make new decisions. But also surrender is about surrendering to the emotions that we feel and letting them be there and letting them process it, letting them tell us what they need to tell us. A lot of times the lack of surrendering or the lack of letting go is because the controller doesn't want us to connect with those parts who really do have so much valuable information for us, even though it often comes with some pretty yucky emotions, right? But there's so much value in that. And the controller knows that the more you work with those emotions, the more likely you are to change, right? Which is true. By the way, that's not just something the controller knows. It literally is the case. As you work through emotions, you will change, your life will change, things will get better. But before they get better, the letting go has to happen. And that's a piece that the controller is going to fight just as hard as they possibly can. Okay. So, but when we do it voluntarily, it is a much better life than when we don't do it voluntarily. And I'm going to talk about what it looks like when we hold on too long and the universe is kind of done with us. Now, I know the way I'm talking about the universe doesn't sound very supportive. The universe is incredibly supportive of us. They are always giving us messages, oftentimes all day long. We are hearing from the universe all the time. That doesn't mean we're catching most of the messages because we have this sort of controller sitting in the mind, running the mind, working the mind, keeping us really from being able to connect with most universal messages. It doesn't mean we don't catch some, but we probably catch about, 2%, 5% of what we're actually being sent in general. So when we aren't listening, the universe comes in and they can force our hand, right? So the universe forces our hand and says, okay, if you won't let go of that voluntarily, it's gonna go anyway. Okay. And so I wrote, again, three is the number of the day. So I wrote 3 things that that have a tendency to happen when we have held on to something for too long, right? Because when we choose to voluntarily let go of something, it can be at least somewhat graceful. I mean, truthfully, it still probably doesn't feel graceful because there's a lot of emotion in that, but it's more graceful. When the universe does it for us, it looks different. It looks kind of like destruction, for example, can be pretty devastating destruction. And it's usually around what we thought was pretty darn important to us. So this is devastating. It can be quite re-traumatizing for us to experience these things. But if we follow the emotions where they go, it can be very life-changing. Like, we can choose to ride that wave, but the controller probably will fight pretty hard against that. The second one is the loss, right? So destruction and loss, obviously they're very similar, but sometimes we just flat out lose something, someone. There's a loss that happens, and there is grief that comes with that loss. Again, we need to ride that wave associated with that loss. And I'll be honest, sometimes the controller or the love seeker is telling us that this loss is the end of who we are. This loss is the end of everything, right? That's oftentimes the kind of message we hear. So it's important to let ourselves process the grief associated with it, because the reason we're losing that is because we need to do that to grow and potentially to attract new things into our space. And those new things may pretty cool. Now, again, are they temporary too? Probably. Yes, they tend to be, but this is about learning how to ride the wave of the temporariness and the emotions associated with that are a part of life. This is hard stuff. The number one part that will get in the way of this is going to be the controller. And the last one is a deep sense that the universe is against us. Okay. And I've sort of been talking a little bit about this already, that it feels like they're punishing us. It feels like that the universe is taking things from us on purpose just to bring about significant pain. And this is coming from a place of our trauma, generally speaking. We are projecting onto the universe the behaviors of our abusers, who probably did take things from us on purpose. Let's face it, that's pretty common in a childhood of complex trauma. So we are projecting that onto the universe and saying the universe is taking away from me because I am being punished, because they're against me, right? That same kind of message comes in. And generally speaking, even with some of the most devastating losses, that isn't actually the reason. But I will say, it can feel like it. And so, what are some of the things we can do about this? Just in the last couple of minutes. The first one is when we feel ourselves holding controller, writing is our best friend. We need to write from, I refuse to let go of this. I refuse to change. I refuse to do this. It's a bad, 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 bad idea, right? That's the controller in a nutshell. Writing from that is extremely helpful in our journey. I highly recommend it. The other thing I recommend writing from is this notion that the world or the universe is against us, that we are being punished, that we're being punished because something is wrong with us. Whatever that reason is that you're hearing, let that write to. It often does have a strong tie back to our original abusers, and it also has a strong tie to the controller's perspective around the temporariness of life, because it just is. It's not a punishment, but oh my goodness, our controllers will think that it is. Yeah, every time. So try some writing like that and see how you might be holding on to what isn't necessarily serving you anymore, and work with that a little bit. I've certainly been doing a whole lot of work with that lately. It feels like a ton of work with that. So that's why I'm bringing it to you, right? Because I am bringing you what I am learning from myself most of the time. Jan is saying, incredibly healing information, helpful to work on holding on to somatic feelings. Thank you. Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you all for being here today and for being a part of this. And I look forward to talking to you next week. Same time, same place. Thank you all so much for being here.